everybody. Those of you who are here present and those who are following through the YouTube channel of Casa Árabe. This 16th course is something that we started last year that allows us to have very narrow relationships with the university program, including conferences and talks from experts. We have the great pleasure of cooperating for this conference with the University of Madrid, the Complutense University, the studies of history, Spanish contemporary art. These are the program that are mentoring this precise conference we are attending today that the students can follow. And as I was saying, we have the pleasure of having Morad Montazami, who's a very well-known name in the world of art in regards to this very wide area, which is Arab art. He's a very important person because of his works, because of what he has achieved, and as curator, he's curated a great number of exhibitions like Baghdad Museum and the Institute of Culture of the exhibition for Morad Melehi is a great expert on him, and all the modern art in Casablanca, he is very familiar, or Monaco, Alexandria, a great tour, world capitals, and cosmopolitan surrealism, which has the focal point of Egypt. So these are some of the examples of the wide array of conferences that he has curated and exhibitions. One of the other activities that Morad has been carrying out along the years, and which makes him a very appreciated speaker, is something that has to do with the modern and contemporary arts regarding the Arab world. The work he does from Zaman Books, which is a house based in Paris. He edits a great deal of books he publishes with incredible quality, and we are really witnessing the great brilliance of the new writings in the world of history and art. So this Post-Petroleum Museum and soft power between crisis and second life is one of the topics that interest Morad. They're very important regarding the knowledge of what is happening in the world of creation, as well as museums, as it is the case in this case. Susana Calvo is going to, she's professor of history of art in the University Complutense of Madrid. She is going to introduce him and put it in perspective regarding what most interests his students, because as we said, they are mentoring this conference. Susana. Thank you, Nuria. Thank you, Casa Árabe, for hosting this course. Thank you, Morad, of course, for participating in this series of conferences. So we thought it was very pertinent, the presence of Morad Montazami this afternoon, because, well, firstly, I met him, I knew his activity, particularly publishing activity, and the concerns he has really have to do with what we deal when we deal with history of art, particularly Islamic art, because there are very many questions surfacing these last years, particularly as from 2011, regarding all the conflicts in the Maghreb and Middle East, and as historians of art, we're very much concerned with the fact of protecting the our works of art and our inheritance, and how to really bring back to life the inheritance, how to bring it back to the population, give it back to the population of the world in general, and really make it from criteria that are just and equal, that do not have to do with the actions carried out in the 19th century, but rather something that has to do with the West and the East, and sometimes the history is not the same, and we have to see what people do in that region of the world, and are concerned with Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Palestine, all those places that are really losing their richness, artistic richness. So without further ado, we're going to give the floor to Morad. Please do tell us, speak about the title of the conference, Post-Petroleum Museum and Soft Power Between Christ Second, live from the Iraqi National Museum of Baghdad to the Louvre Abu Dhabi. Thank you. So we're going to give the floor to Morad for his conference, and then we will have a Q&A session.
Morad, thank you.
Thank you. Can you all hear me while I speak like this? It's okay? Yeah, right. So thank you very much to Casa Arab. I'm very happy to be here. And thank you especially to Nuria Medina for her very kind introduction about my past and recent activities, and also to Susana Calvo for her introduction about the role of museums in civil society, and also in a non-Western context regarding also conflicting zones or, post-war situations that non-Western museums have to deal with. So it was a very good and very kind way of introducing everything. I'm very grateful for this, and I'm really happy to be with you, and I regret I can't speak Spanish. I would have loved to, but I'm not able, so I'm sorry for speaking English. I will try to speak slowly and distinctly, so I'm not giving a hard time to our translator, who I thank as well. So I will propose you tonight a kind of per course into different museum histories and different temporalities of this issue. The title of the lecture in itself sets a lot of these matters and a lot of these questions. Post-Petroleum Museum is a very simple category that I propose to look at different museums that have been founded and museums who have been invented or conceptualized through the oil economy and through the economic growth of countries like Iran, Iraq, or the Gulf countries between the 1970s and until today, actually. So there is a clear reason, or let's say a clear context, that maybe I will manage to draw here about this notion of post-petroleum museum, and that brings us to this idea of soft power, which I'm not sure needs to be translated in French or in Spanish, because it's a very English expression and notion that museums or even private collections or different sets of artistic infrastructures can function as diplomatic tool. And that idea of the museum or the art collection as a soft power, which is, again, a geopolitical tool, has been very enhanced recently. Of course, with the Gulf, the Emirates, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, who came into that strategy very, let's say, bluntly, without mystery about it. Like they are dealing with museums and collections as soft power, which is an expression that they endorse, again, quite transparently. But that notion of soft power is not so new. We'll try also to see some of its points of origins. And the idea of second life is very basically the fact of reconstitution of destroyed or lost heritage, or when the museum doesn't have to deal only with material culture and physical objects, but comes to deal with their replicas or their digitization or beyond material culture and beyond physical objects. So all of these notions come together at a certain point of time, which is now. The idea of post-petroleum museums and soft power, with the idea of a general state of crisis, because there have been so many violent conflicts and so many damages to material culture and to museum artifacts in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, in Iran, in so many places of Near East and Middle East, that crisis as such, or the second life of these objects, lost, destroyed, robbed, looted, is also becoming a general condition of the museum today. So I will begin by talking about a kind of symbolic image, which is a photography, and I will come back later to this place, which is the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, the TIMOCA, which was founded in 1977, the same year than the Centre Pompidou, for example, the French National Museum. The same year was founded in Iran, the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. I will come back to it in more details, but for now I would like to look at this image, which is a photograph taken inside the museum in 2007, actually by an artist whose name is Alessandro Balteo Yazbek. I'm not really commenting upon his artwork because he took this photo as an element of a broader installation that he made about Cold War issues and matters involving Iran. I just use this sample of his work just for the matter of what it shows from the inside of the museum, but it was also photographed by a lot of other people, what you see here, which is the superimposition or the kind of juxtaposition of an Alexander Calder, the American sculptor who did mobiles sculpture. You can see some at the Reina Sofia, of course, and the double portrait of Iranian supreme leaders of the Islamic Republic and of the Islamic Revolution of 1979, who are the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the original supreme leader of the Islamic Revolution of 1979 in Iran, and also the current supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who is still in power nowadays in Iran. And again, this photograph that you see here is not an image only taken by this artist. It's an image that was taken by many people, but it's not actually an image that you can take from anywhere in the museum because the portraits are hung very high and the colder sculpture is suspended from the main ceiling part of the museum in a way that if you want to take this photograph, you have to take it from a certain floor, from a certain height. You can't get this image of the juxtaposition from anywhere in the museum. You have to stand at a certain floor and at a certain point in order to see that juxtaposition happening. And what's interesting about it, and we will come back to it later, is also the interior architecture of that museum. Because the inside space of the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art is a replica of Frank Lloyd Wright spiral of the Guggenheim in New York. You know, the spiral space in which you keep turning around while getting up in the floors. And that's how you can take this, this picture of this. This picture is like very iconic, let's say, of the ideological and the political contradictions or the seemingly political paradox behind the museum itself, the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. Obviously, because on the one hand you have one of the most modern and abstract American sculpture. Remember that the 1979 Islamic Revolution was mainly driven against Western powers and obviously against the United States, who had already organized a coup d'etat in 1953 of the Iranian nationalistic Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Was a very turmoil and a very violent and dark times when the American overthrown the Iranian Prime Minister in the 50s, when the Iranian Prime Minister wanted to nationalize oil. And the oil nationalization, which meant for Iranian people to get back their own hands on Iranian oil, which had been exploited by the British and the American and the Russian since the end of the 19th century, gives you the whole kind of ideological and political struggles that went on in Iran almost through all the 20th century around oil, around the exploitation of Iranian natural resources and mainly oil. Right? Because as we all know, Iran was not colonized per se, or strictly speaking, like Algeria was colonized, or like other Asian and African countries were colonized by Western powers, the French, the German, the British, etc. Iran was not strictly colonized, but its natural resources and its oil, in a way, was always colonized, or at least appropriated by Western powers. So it's like a colonization of natural resource, if you want not to speak about strict colonialism, which makes a very specific and particular situation in 20th century in Iran regarding Western powers, a kind of love and hate relationship, a kind of let's say mix of acceptance and reluctance, or collaboration and also political tensions, which will come to a peak close to 79, of course, because then the revolution happens and the Western powers will have no power anymore, of course, with what all that happened with the Islamic Revolution of 1979 and the overthrow of the last Shah, the last king of Iran, of the Pahlavi dynasty. and until this day, of course, because the Islamic Republic is still in power today, of course. And we still hear about all the conflict that it entails with Western powers around, for instance, the nuclear agreement and how the Western powers and Iranian power fight diplomatically or economically, make agreement, then ruin those agreements again, and nowadays trying to get back to these agreements, which should make Iranian people lives easier after many years of embargo, for receiving medicine, for example, in Iran, or other kind of economic transactions which were banned for Iranian people and economy. So this image is a kind of unexpected encounter between two totally contradictory iconographies, which is the American modernist, abstract, post-war iconography, and the kind of almost socialist, realist portraits of the two ayatollahs, which is clearly nothing modern, clearly nothing abstract, nothing exciting artistically. Maybe it becomes something else when they juxtapose and they become the embodiment of this kind of, not even contradiction, but maybe schizophrenia between East and West, between sacred and profane. Modernism is profanity, and the supreme leaders is a sacred sense, or even between, in a way, tradition and modernity, let's say, this famous paradox that we always hear about when it comes to the Middle East, about tradition and modernity. I mean, that's where you get it in the bluntest and kind of harshest image or unexpected image you can imagine. Sorry. And it also tells you that during the 1979 Islamic Revolution, I always put Islamic into inverted commas because they were not only Islamists who overthrew the Shah. There were also leftists, Marxists, nationalists, different political trends and groups that were then kind of hijacked, if you want, by the Islamic forces that gave way to the Islamic Republic. Again, I'm using this image also in order to let you know that when the Iranian Revolution happened, a lot was destroyed in the city, culturally, architecturally, economically. The cinemas were destroyed, burned down, the statues were overthrown, the streets were, overflowing with deprivation or ruins or popular writings, or a kind of visual invasion of the revolution, be it with protest signs or just destruction. But the famous collection of modern art, of Western modern art, including not only Calder, but also Picasso, and even Monet, Impressionist painting to Gauguin, and until Donald Judd, minimalist sculptures, that's known to be probably the largest Western modern art collection outside of the West. And that was accumulated and capitalized by the king of Iran, Reza Shah Pahlavi, and especially the Empress, his wife, the Empress Farah Diba, who was the main protagonist for collecting these artworks during the 70s and then flourishing ultimately with the inauguration of the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art in 1977, and of course doing a lot of exhibitions, which I will show you in those 2 years, between 77 and 79, before the revolution. When the regime changed and became the Islamic Republic, the museum was not destroyed, and the collection particularly was not destroyed. Obviously, all the revolutionary forces knew the value of the collection. So it was not destroyed, it was preserved, in spite of all the destruction that were going on in Tehran at that time. And the museum kind of stopped showing them. They didn't stop showing them forever, but certainly during the 80s and the 90s, the collection, the Western art collection that was shown between 77 and 79 was kind of marginalized and put in storage without being shown, at least for the 80s and 90s, obviously because the Ayatollahs and the Islamic Republic didn't want to show the Picasso and the Francis Bacon and the Jackson Pollock, at least seen as embodiments of, you know, Western modernism and everything they have been fighting for in order to fight the Shah of Iran, who was so much known for his love of the West and his tendencies to the United States, France, etc. But it also tells you that what we call a soft power nowadays, with that expression being very much used by the Gulf countries, the Emirates, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, and the ultimate example of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, of course, was something that maybe was already begun in the end of the 70s in Iran. The fact of collecting art in order to transform the general mentalities of your country, but also in order to make relationship and connections with different regimes, or in a way to become the kind of Western capital of the Middle East, you know, which was somehow the dream of Reza Shah Pahlavi, you know, to become like the Swiss or the France of the Middle East, you know. So all these ideas maybe have one of their point of origins about post-petroleum museums, because that collection was all the benefit and the product of oil growth and the petrol economy in Iran. Obviously, you can say it's only oil money. Everything was bought. The Pollocks, the Calder, the Picasso, everything was bought with oil money. Even the museum was constructed with oil money, of course, you know. And this is certainly one of the points of origin. I wanted to show you an image of a travel guide, which is called Petite Planet, Small Planet. It was one of the first travel guide collection of Le Seuil, the French publisher, and it had a very avant-garde graphic designer who was Chris Marker. Maybe some of you heard about Chris Marker, who was a French avant-garde filmmaker who collaborated with Jean-Luc Godard and other experimental filmmaker of the 60s and 70s. Before he became a famous filmmaker, he was a graphic designer for that collection of travel books published in the 50s in France. You know, you had one book for each country you visited. But it was a very intellectual travel guide, not a travel guide that would only tell you the restaurant and the monuments, a travel guide that would tell you about the geography, the history, even with colonial history insights, like super intellectual travel guide. And at the end of it, a few pages with the restaurant and the museum and the monuments. And the iconography is an incredible mix of photography, paintings, with the whole idea of montage and juxtaposition of different material, from art history to popular visual culture. So this is the issue about Iran. And at the end of it, you have a double page with a very blunt but very unexpected montage. This was published in 1957, the book. So 4 years after the coup against Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, and that really crystallized the whole aggressivity between Iran and the West, which is a montage between two panoramas. One panorama of Persepolis archaeological site, you know, with the antiquities, pillars, and the ruins and remains that you would find in Persepolis when you visited as a tourist. And below, it's an oil refinery, an oil industrial site of south of Iran, in Abadan. And again here, just like the juxtaposition of the Calder and the Ayatollah's portrait, you have another phenomenon of two temporalities or two iconographies unexpectedly coming together, creating a kind of bridge between those two images of the past and the present, of Iranians, or pre-Iranian, which was the Persian Empire revealed through its most exquisite antiquities and archaeological heritage, and on the other hand, the tremendous economic growth and empowerment of modern Iran through oil economy, but looking like each other, finding some visual affinity, or trying to find a visual reason for it almost, you know, by the kind of similarity of the archaeological pillars and the chimneys and tubes of the oil refinery. And in a way showing how they are bound to each other, in a way showing this kind of post-petroleum museum or culture I'm talking about is something that we are more able to grasp today when we look at the 20th century and we understand how oil and petrol was the key pattern to understand probably all modernity, if you want to understand it from the infrastructures, from the energies, from the resource that caused so many wars, so many coups, so many revolutions. They all have the same link for that period of time, which is oil. Really? Ah, wow, interesting. So we can't take more time, right? No, we can't. Okay.
5 minutes.
5 minutes more, okay. So one of the, so here, for example, you have during the 1979 revolution, the Tehran Faculty of Fine Arts, like the Fine Arts School of Tehran, during revolution, which was occupied by the leftist student. At that point, it was a few days before the Shah will fly out of Iran and allow for Ayatollah Khomeini to arrive in the country. And there was a very interesting phenomenon of occupation of the university, occupation to make it a museum, a makeshift or a street museum of the revolution itself happening outside, which means that most of the posters, most of the graffitis, most of the caricatures that were pasted in the streets, in the walls of the streets of Tehran, were then replicated by the leftist student with lithograph or with photocopy, or by replicating them inside the faculty in a kind of open museum of caricature, graffiti, and posters about the revolution at the same time the revolution happens. So this is a very ephemeral and a very disruptive example of a museum It's not a proper museum, but the leftist students turn it into a museum. And then later on, Iranian regime has been investing on museum through much more gigantic and impressive technology, which is the Iran-Iraq War Museum that you have in the north of Tehran, with a very postmodern architecture and an incredibly technologic and high-tech scenography and use of video and almost feel like contemporary art installation, all to revive the memories and the suffering and, of course, the Iranian narrative of the Iran-Iraq war against Saddam Hussein, which lasted for more than 8 years, almost during all the 80s, the direct outcome of the 1979 revolution. So this is a museum here. When I tell you their installation almost look like contemporary art, almost look like an installation by Mona Hatoum or by Walid Raad, but it's not contemporary artists. It's like pure ideological displays about the Iran-Iraq war. And it's maybe one of the most striking post-petroleum museums for the investment that was made in it, recreating ruins, bringing airplanes, weapons, martyrs, video projections, something mind-blowing in terms of technological investment and also in terms of, obviously, propagandist tools, of course. And then we arrived to the Baghdad Museum lootings in 2003, as you know, with the Second Gulf War, when the American, again, the American, what can we do, invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein. You remember all the consequences of 9/11 and the American arguing for Saddam Hussein to be one of the accomplices of Osama bin Laden, which, you know, brought to the invasion of Iraq and brought to so many killings, so many destructions, and that eventually obviously brought us to what we called the terrorist group of the Islamic State and ISIS, of course, because most of the ISIS and terrorists and fighters were jailed in the jail that was organized by the American, and most of them were previously from the Iraqi army or from the Iraqi mercenaries who were put in jail by the Americans and the Allies in 2003. Anyway, that's not my point. I want to show you some photographs that were taken by a Lebanese journalist and archaeologist, Joanne Farshah Bajali, who was the first journalist, she also happens to be an archaeologist, to take photograph of the Baghdad Museum lootings 2 or 3 days after the invasion, the American invasion of 2003. So you can see here that she takes photos from the outside of the building, and you can see even the protections that the museum staff had tried to put in front of the windows or the walls of the museum in anticipation of the bombardings. And what's important is that testimony of the fact that when the American came to occupy Baghdad and overthrow Saddam Hussein, they protected the oil reserve and the oil storage, but they didn't protect the Baghdad Museum. And they did that totally consciously. It was an absolute conscious decision of the American state of protecting the oil refineries and storage and not care about what can happen to the Baghdad Museum, which is only probably the first or the second biggest museum of Middle Eastern antiquities with the Cairo Museum, and they simply decided not to care about it while invading the country, and that's how the lootings happened, and the museum was invaded by a crowd of people in which you couldn't even distinguish who were the American looters or the Iraqi looters, and led to the looting of more than 1,500 objects. Let's say 15,000 objects from 2003. Here you have other images and photographs that shows the protections that the museum staff tried to organize before everything was looted or destroyed. Other images of the empty vitrines and broken up vitrines and or objects, artifacts. This is the original catalog of the Baghdad Museum from the 70s, which is one of the main documents when you want to have a kind of inventory, a visual inventory of these objects in the past, in black and white photograph, but in a very nice layout and a very nice designed catalog. This is how the main entrance of the Baghdad Museum, Assyrian antiquities looked like, very well designed, as you can see, in the 70s, with very modern system of lighting. And this is how it looked on the right side image after the lootings. And obviously the lootings gave way to a lot of digital database. There were a lot of archaeologists, Iraqi archaeologists in collaboration with British, Italian and French archaeologists, and also European custom police, Interpol, in order to trace all of these 15,000 objects through the time. Okay, and to sum it up, you can note that more than half of the 15,000 objects were recovered. More than half of the 15,000 objects, and the museum could reopen in 2018, 4 years ago. I was there in Baghdad for shortly after the museum was renovated and reopened and reintegrated all of these recovered objects. But these database that you can find online, for example, this one was one of the first database after 2003, so from 2004 or 5, which is the Chicago University Oriental Department database of the lost treasures of the Baghdad Museum. It's still online. You can go on it, on Google, and you will find thousands of objects inventored and classified on that digital database, which in a way is a digital testimony or inventory of the lost object, but also in a way of the museum itself. I would say in a way, in 1979, the Iranian leftists and Marxists invented the concept of the ephemeral revolutionary museum by occupying their university. And nowadays, we have another concept of an ephemeral or nomadic museum, which is the digital database that allows for these objects to be shared, to be circulated, to be debated, obviously not physically, but digitally. And even beyond that, as we were discussing with our colleagues, a lot of digital companies and new post-conflict archaeological initiatives also to do 3D replicas. So now we are even beyond digitization or immaterial culture, because there are more and more initiatives to recreate the objects in 3D, in volumetric 3D replicas. With even a Spanish initiatives with a group of people called Factum, and you can even find artists who do that, like Michael Rakovitz and other artists who work around different forms of replicas, artistic replicas, archaeological replicas, pedagogic replicas, ironic replicas. So obviously there is not just one concept of replicas, obviously, or reenactment. Okay. 10 more minutes. 10, only 10. These are the photographs by Latif Alani, who is one of the most important and rediscovered, because his photos were completely forgotten after the 70s when he quit photography, because he had a very intense activity of being almost the official Iraqi photographer of all Iraqi's archaeological sites, and to have a visual and photographic record of Iraqi artifacts and visual culture. He was commissioned by the Iraqi Ministry of Communication and Culture from the 60s, during the 60s. And that gave way to this exceptional body of photograph in which you can see not only archaeological and cultural sites, but the general Iraqi infrastructure, urbanism, the past and the present coming together, even the traditional dwellings, houses, and then the shift to modern housing or architecture with always antiquities and pre-Islamic artifacts in the landscape, obviously something, because there at that point antiquities and pre-Islamic culture is really integrated in everyday life, in the city, in the outside space. And here on the left, the emergence of modern housing in Iraq and modern mass building houses next to the Tigris River, where you can see almost the old landscape of the Bedouin people and merchant, now slightly transformed by the apparition of modern housing and modern buildings in the same traditional landscape. This is end of 50s, beginning 60s, when Latif Alani was really that iconic photographer. You even have a kind of Bauhaus architecture, cylindric building in the middle of one of the most traditional streets of Baghdad, which is Rashid Street, because you had modernist architects like Frank Lloyd Wright or Le Corbusier, who came to Baghdad, visited Baghdad, and even built buildings for Baghdad. This is the book in which you can find all of Latif Alani's photograph, published by Hattie Kantz 5 years ago, when his photos were rediscovered and republished, also with the help of the Arab Image Foundation, which is this archival organism in Beirut that kept all the digitized photograph of Latif. And unfortunately, Latif left us recently. He passed away a few months ago, unfortunately. So his heritage is now definitely to be highlighted and to be rediscussed. This is the 1974 Baghdad Biennale, one of the first pan-Arab contemporary art biennale in the Arab world, beside Iran, because the first Tehran biennial was in 1955. And this is also a true embodiment of the breakthrough of contemporary art installations through oil economy. You had a very wealthy family in Iraq, which was the Gulbenkian family, who have this foundation in Portugal. But in the 50s and 60s, the Gulbenkian family was the biggest financer of modern art and museum and also archaeological site preservation. So that's also the kind of soft power through the oil economy that gave way to this incredible Baghdad Biennial of 1974. Even the way people are dressed and the way people become a spectator, become a visitor of a contemporary art exhibition tells you a lot about how Western culture and Eastern culture have been combined and have been not only conflicting but also merging into a new kind of globalization through oil economy in the 70s. And this is the comeback to the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art inauguration in 1977 with all this crowd of people around the outside architecture of the Tehran Museum with dancers, performers dancing around the building, on the roof of the museum, dancers in front of a Picasso painting inside the museum, things that a lot of Iranian people would not understand. And a lot of Iranian people were very angry to see such an aristocratic, such a Western, such an elitist trend of art and museum organization in Iran. And actually led also probably a lot of that cultural and cultural schizophrenia crystallized by the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art certainly contributed to then the explosion of that social tension with the 79 revolution. Here you have an oil installation by a Japanese artist who created an oil pool, a swimming pool but with a black liquid, which is fake oil, and was installed by this Japanese artist at the ground floor. And here you can see the spiral shape that's a replica of Frank Lloyd Wright's spiral in the Guggenheim, New York. Here you can see images of Farah Diba welcoming the first Jackson Pollock and Picasso painting that she bought and during their installation in the museum. All of these photographs are taken by a woman whose name is Gila Dejam and who was the in-house photographer of the TIMOCA since day one. And she left the museum beginning 2000. So she photographed all the inside life and exhibition of the museum for more than 30 years. Pop art exhibition, Andy Warhol exhibition, Vasarely exhibitions happening between 77 and 79, or city-making urbanism exhibitions about cities, about New York, Paris, Tehran, with light box. The photographs were not even printed. They were installed on light box to tell you the money and the technology that was invested for a photography exhibition in Iran in the 70s on light box. And this is the Louvre Abu Dhabi. My main point will become my conclusion because we don't have so much time. So I will just take 2 minutes for this conclusion around the Louvre Abu Dhabi, you know. You all heard about it, of course, this partnership between the Emirates and France, the Louvre becoming a brand, there is no other word, and it's totally assumé, it's totally claimed. You know, nowadays we are in a neo-capitalist ideology. We don't have so many Marxists anymore, so we're not arguing about the terms. You know, soft power is something that they use very, again, transparently. The fact that the Louvre Museum becomes a brand that can be exported. You know, you have the same with the Centre Pompidou, which now is exported to China with Centre Pompidou Shanghai, to Brussels, Centre Pompidou Canal, and that's the same for the Louvre. And that's what soft power means, of course, when national heritage or museum collection also become a transparent or manifest geopolitical tool for international cooperation, for stabilizing, you know, tensions or pre-war situations, and so many considerations around that geopolitics. So they would, I mean, there is a lot to say because I tried to work around the general analysis of their display, of the display strategy how things are shown, how things are underlined, how they are staged or mise en scène, in which there is a lot to say about their scenography, the aesthetics of minimalism, but in a kind of global discourse with global mapping and a kind of geographical aesthetic of the desert, also of emptiness and substance, or even the way some of the objects are floating into these very much transparent vitrines in a space where the objects almost disappear in favor of a very light and a very kind of floating scenography. This is the introduction room of that global discourse around new universalism, new East and West combinations, new globalized art history. You know, when pre-Islamic, Western, Assyrian, Mesopotamian, and the Middle Age, and everything comes almost to the same level, a kind of flattening or softening of all the different temporalities and periods into one kind of universal plateau, if you want. And this is then encouraged by digitization, because as many objects as you can find in the Louvre Abu Dhabi, you can also find their digitized version or the digitized replica, high-resolution reproductions of objects, of high-resolution screens that makes your visit half real and half virtual in a way. Of course, you can do the virtual tour online. And if you do the virtual tour on your computer, you have some window that can suddenly pop up on your screen. But even when you do it physically, you have kind of screen popping up around you. Screen that become part of that of your own path into the museum and puts you in a situation to deal with kind of half physical, half digital culture. It's not that easy to find your way, to know what to read first or where to look, or to be almost caught by screens, where in some of the steps and rooms of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, the screen themselves and the dematerialized object become the main subject. And when you're literally taken between them, or they integrally take the space around you in place of physical objects. And you can even, of course, touch the screens, and you can participate in an interactive way. So my argument here as a conclusion, because we should stop, I think, is basically that the whole destruction and the whole violence of wars, lootings, coup d'etat, and revolution that brought so many destroyed objects and lost objects is a kind of unconscious that remains in the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and maybe even stronger, since the Louvre Abu Dhabi also stands for not only showing physical objects, but also in a way try to reconstitute or try to reenact through digitization all that lost heritage, including the objects that are not part of the Louvre collection or Abu Dhabi itself. What I mean by that is that unconscious of all these destructions, you know, there is a famous quote by Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher, that says every document of culture is at the same time a document of barbarism. It's a very blunt sentence about the fact that any artwork, any artifact, cultural artifact, contains its own inventiveness, creativity of the object, and potential destruction, potential death of that inventiveness and creativity, because iconoclasm always existed, of course, and wars, global wars also always existed. Even lootings of objects, of course, always existed. So in a way, the Louvre Abu Dhabi is at the same time the peak of the attempt or the desire for a new universalism that will be worked out through this idea of reinventing, recollecting, digitizing, and of course also the kind of mauvaise conscience or bad conscience in a way of all the destructions and all the lost heritage behind this thirst for creating a new kind of universalism. So thank you very much for your attention, and if you have questions, maybe we can go into more details. Thank you very much. Sorry that I was too long.
No, thank you very much, Morad, for for following my my indication on the time. I was suffering really too much about that, because I wanted you to go until the very end with all the material, which is fantastic and absolutely interesting, and we didn't want to stop you, but I mean we have to stick to the time.
Of course.
So I think it's time to, bueno, hablo en español, que tenemos también traducción. Es hora de turno de preguntas, así que...
So, questions, Q&A, you have the floor. If you have any question or matter to discuss, people who are following us from the YouTube channel may also write their questions on the chat, and I will read them to the guest. Also, Susana, you can also have a go at a question.
You can also ask very simple questions, of course. I mean, things that you want to know about a certain factual questions. I mean.
I don't know if I should speak in English.
Hay traducción simultánea, así que puedes hablar en español o en inglés, como quieras.
Yes. I think as I don't know if I had time to assimilate what I want to say, I rather ask in Spanish.
Okay, so let me put the...
Okay. Digamos que
So I was very much interested about the whole lecture, so thank you very much, because it was an approximation to the topic in a very short time of what has happened since the 50s, particularly 60s, but also 50s initially. So what I was shocked about was the dematerialization of the artifact or the work of art, how the content changes and the meaning, how it changes if it is used by powers, be it religious or governmental powers that put in relationship different latitudes, countries, cultures, but at the same time the word soft is very pertinent, because maybe it does take away some charge of power to the work of art. So it takes away the context with all its natural charge. So from the one hand, you have the advantage of, getting closer, and that the heritage doesn't get lost. There's something that remains, but on the other hand, it is denaturalized in a way, the work of art, and therefore the intense capacity it has to generate criticism or concepts gets lost, because they are very much rooted in the culture. So that would be, if I understood correctly, the concept that you wanted to convey to us. On the other hand, I'll maybe stop there. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you put things in a very nice order, so it's a very nice complement to my argumentation. And yes, I totally agree with how you exposed it. So soft power obviously is something that has been used. I mean, obviously it's not only related to art. For example, the fact that the Qatari will buy a soccer team in England or in France, like they bought the Paris football team, is also soft power. So soft power is not restricted to art, but art has been one of the most efficient tools for soft powering in the recent geopolitics, especially between the Gulf and Europe. So, but you are right. There is something that will never be totally resolved. We somehow always remain between some loss of what Walter Benjamin had famously called the aura of the work of art. And certainly Walter Benjamin's aura had to do with the physicality and the physical qualities of the artwork, and the fact that by its dematerialization, it can also reach more people. Actually, this was already in Walter Benjamin's, because Benjamin's main argument was that photography and the postcard will make an artwork accessible to everyone, in spite of losing, or beyond even losing its aura, it will become super accessible. So in that sense, Benjamin had already anticipated probably our soft power today, but maybe the only difference now has to do with the fact that in Benjamin's time and photography, that potential from losing the aura to becoming super accessible or reproducible was something still physical because of the physicality of the photography, even if we didn't look at it at that time. And nowadays, it doesn't even have to do with the physicality of the document, because it has to do probably with the high resolution. The level of resolution has become the new myth. Yes. The myth that something can be not super accessible, but hyper visible. You know, on Google Earth, when you go into a museum of Prado and you go to see a work of Goya inside the Prado through Google Earth, you are able to zoom in Goya's artwork in a way that the human eye is not able to zoom. So now the myth of super accessibility has been replaced in a way by hyper visibility, and it's kind of mythical, infiniteless resolution, which brings us to obviously other questions, but yeah.
Yes, I fully agree with what you are saying, but I do think there are some hues that, for instance, in photography or cinema, within its essence is the reproducibility. Mm-hmm. I mean, you are not killing the original, mm-hmm. because the essence is the reproduction.
Yes.
Whereas when you get with a zoom into a museum and you can see more than the eye can see, you are seeing something else.
Yeah.
You are not seeing the original work, I would say. No? In any case, it's part of the developing of life, and it talks about how we have to preserve no?
Yeah.
And many other things, but I like others too.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
But I think it's very interesting.
Justamente.
Yes, incidentally, regarding what you were saying right now, the doubt I had just right now in the Abu Dhabi Louvre, what kind of pieces, what kind of works of art do we have? Because the definition, well, I go back to very ancient works of art, and sometimes we just lose the history, the context of those objects once you exhibit them in a museum. And that installation in Abu Dhabi, where the artifacts hang from the ceiling, it's quite something apart from a work of art that includes its history and tradition. So I don't know, this Abu Dhabi Museum and that game of screens, digital play, I don't really understand what the purpose is. Is it to inform about the works of art, or just keep it fuzzy?
Good question. I mean, most of the time, the digitized object is used in a kind of post-encyclopedic goal, which is to tell you more about the object, because the digitized image goes with a lot of text and a lot of explanations. But while learning about the objects, it seems that the objects needs to be digitized or dematerialized in a way. And there are also objects that are digitized because they are not physically present, right? So there's at least two different purposes, which is one, illustrating the knowledge or illustration of the text by high resolution illustrations and objects. And also, of course, the more kind of post-conflict reason, which is to make present an object which is absent. And then somehow my point is that maybe we pass the red line when this digitization becomes like a mise en scène of universalism. Maybe it can be used in a kind of more restrictive, maybe more reasonable way or rhythm. But in the Louvre Abu Dhabi, it's quite overwhelming. It's quite everywhere. And as a matter of fact, it contributes to the idea that the new universalism can only be immaterial in a way, or maybe not immaterial, but just digitized and going through that new myth of the high resolution image. But it's, I think, in what happens in Louvre Abu Dhabi, for me, is the kind of prefiguration of things that will become more diffused in all museums worldwide, and for each museum to invent its own way or its own use or its own reason for using digitized object or dematerialized culture, because I don't want to say it's bad and I don't want to say it's good, obviously. I just want to point some of maybe the excessive uses in order maybe to find maybe more appropriate or maybe more reasoned uses of it, which I'm sure almost all museums will have to deal with or already are dealing with.
Hola, en primer lugar agradecerle.
Hello. Well, firstly, thank you for your lecture. It has been very interesting. And secondly, regarding what my colleagues were asking, I would like to go back to the Iraqi National Museum. You mentioned that most of the objects that got lost could not be recovered. Regarding this, was it included in the narrative? Was the digitization of the objects, was it included, and to fill the void that was left by its disappearance?
You mean when the Baghdad Museum reopened, you mean? That's also a good question. So, okay, half of the looted objects were recovered and collected, which is roughly 7,000 to 8,000 objects. Out of the 15,000, 50% was recovered, and that recovery gave way to the renovation of the Baghdad Museum, reopening in 2018. There is not a single screen. There is not a single screen, and there is not a single digitization tool in the Baghdad Museum. It's very vintage, and it's a very kind of old school, old-fashioned museum. For some reason, obviously, doing with general economy and state of the country, they are not dealing with that level of technology. So all their investment was about the renovation of the building and the museum rooms, and obviously the restoration of most of the objects that reintegrated the collection. So in a way, and that's interesting. That's interesting that some of these museums maybe will never become digital museums, you know, and they will resist, even if for contingent reasons. But somehow the Baghdad Museum is definitely a museum that will resist to that, consciously or unconsciously. Because obviously if you talk to the Baghdad Museum director, he's not going to tell you, I'm resisting to digital culture. It's just that it was not an issue for him. But it's interesting to look at it as a museum that somehow resists to that digitization. So that's as a matter of fact, yeah. But maybe the future will tell us something else, maybe.
I mean, also if we integrate entonces hablo en castellano mejor. Me refería también.
Yes, I was referring to the integration of more recent history in the narrative. I don't know whether you have a website where you can see, or there are links to those pieces that got lost, to those objects.
Yeah, about a potential narrative of the lootings within the museum when it reopened. I'm afraid not. And that's really bad. That's really bad. That's really bad that they were not preoccupied for somehow telling the story of the lootings in the reopening and in the new museum rooms. I definitely regret that. I wish I was an advisor for the Iraqi Ministry of Culture and I could have told them about it. Like, you don't need digital culture, but you need to tell the story. And the lootings was such a dramatic and kind of global tragedy that you should definitely make a point about it in order not to erase the story, the history. And I'm afraid in Iran, in Iraq, in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Algeria, there is not the same concern for the writing of history, the writing of cultural history and the archiving of cultural history. It's very sad. I just have to admit that. In those countries, apart from small groups like Arab Image Foundation in Beirut or other activists or artists in those countries, of course, but the state and the public governments simply don't care about the writing of cultural history and the saving of that history. Actually, it's the contrary. As you know, erasing those events, like erasing the signs of Arab Springs, like how the Egyptian revolution of 2011 is totally erased from Egyptian contemporary culture and Egyptian official discourse. There is not a single graffiti, not a single sign, not a single photograph that should remain of the Arab Spring and Egyptian revolution from the state perspective, you know? So this is a quite harsh and obviously sad conception of history, that things should be erased instead of being highlighted and being told. That's like a second tragedy over the first tragedy of the lost heritage, is like the erased history, I'm afraid. Yeah. I mean, we're still here, right? So we can do our job of telling the story, of making seminars, making lectures. So at least we can balance that conscious unconsciousness that most of these countries have with their recent history. Yeah.
Bueno, son las 7:30 de la tarde, and it's 7:30 already, and it's our time limit for lectures. We try to be no more than 1.5 hours.
I can come back anyway.
And you have to come back. I think we could stay asking and talking about how museums have been perceived in those new
So many
cultural
questions,
diplomacy,
yeah.
which is also quite a polemic topic on itself. But I think we have had a great insight from you, Morad. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos.
Thank you for being with us, and we'll have you some other time. Thank you, Susana, for cooperating with Casa Árabe with your university program. Thank you, all of you who are here and those who are following via YouTube. You'll be able to watch this some other time, and well, if you watched it, please tell your friends to watch it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.